Hello, everybody. My name is Rachel Sterling. We are in the Evictions During the Phaseout webinar from Homeline. So make sure you're in the right space. We will be starting here in just a minute. Sorry, I'm getting all of my screens sorted out. So today we will be covering evictions during the phase out and during the 2022 year. We've done similar presentations in the past about the eviction trends and such throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will, this is being recorded. So if you're having to drop or you need to share with somebody, it will be available on our website after today, once we get it sorted out. We will also be applying for CLE credit for this presentation, and we will share that code once we have it. So again, I don't have a code yet, but CLE credit will be applied for. And just a couple other quick housekeeping things. Feel free to ask questions. We encourage it. Any questions either about what you've got here, see here in the screens on the slides, or if you have general landlord tenant law questions here, and we're happy to tackle those to the best of our ability as well. So without further ado, Andrea, Ozzy, can you see my the PowerPoint? Perfect. All right. Then we will go ahead and get started here. All right. So as I alluded to, today we are going to be covering evictions during the phase out, and we will be joined by our eviction data assistant, Oscar Nieves Rubio, and our housing attorney, who is the person who does our evictions queue, all the letters, everything. She is the evictions point person here at Homeline, Andrea Palumbo. And then I'm Rachel Sterling. I am a housing attorney and also communications coordinator here at Homeline. I will be hosting and answering some questions if there are non-eviction related questions that so Andrea can like take sips of water and such. So let us continue on. Those of you who may not know who we are a nonprofit organization. We have been around since 1992, so 30 years this year. We've been able to advise over 289,000 tenants, either through free legal, educational, or advocacy services. We offer our services in 4 languages: English, Somali, Hmong, and Spanish. This is our contact information. We do have the general hotline. Those are the language hotline numbers as well. We also have an email and attorney option. If you are a tenant here in Minnesota and you've got questions about your legal rights as a tenant, we'd be happy to assist with that as we're able. All right, so that is the housekeeping, all about us. I will briefly go over some of the just background about what is the phase out and what came up to before the phase out, just to give us a kind of a grounding on where we were and then what we are going to be, looking at, and why some of the numbers are relevant and why some of the trends that we see are basically based off of what we think is happening because of the phase out that was initiated. So basically starting in March of 2020, when COVID-19 kind of shut everything down, through the end of June of 2021, there was some sort of executive order that restricted evictions here in Minnesota. As you can see here, there were a couple different iterations of those executive orders, and so what types of evictions were allowed or were not allowed, shifted slightly from over over that year and some change. But for the most part, it was that most evictions were not allowed to happen due to public health concerns raised from the pandemic. And so with very few exceptions. These executive orders were replaced by a temporary session law, which is cited here on the slide. Most people were calling it the off-ramp, or the eviction moratorium phase-out was its more formal titling in the temporary session law itself. It went into effect on June 30th of 2021, and the last protection that it offered expired on May 31st of 2022, so this year. So almost a year's worth of essentially phasing out the restrictions that had been put in place through the eviction moratoriums, and allowing different landlords access to the various legal options for filing evictions and terminating leases and such. So what we put together back in 2021, when this was all set up, was this timeline. It was a complicated piece of legislation about when certain restrictions were lifted and when certain options were made available to landlords. And so this was kind of the timeline. So effectively, the biggest issue I think that we certainly were encountering during the eviction moratorium were that landlords were not allowed to evict for non-payment of rent, which you will see put a significant it put a damper on what landlords were able to do. And so these every 90 days or 45 days, 90 days, the phase out would effectively say the landlords can start filing for these reasons, and then giving more of the legal options available pre-pandemic back to landlords. So most of the protections that were in place through the executive orders expired back in October 2021. So landlords could end a lease for any legal reason as long as appropriate notice was given, which they had been restricted from doing for a good majority of 2020. And then landlords are able to file evictions for any legal reason, except, and then this was the big exception, the last protection in place was for folks who had pending applications with COVID-19 emergency rental assistance programs, specifically programs like Rent Help or other programs that were funded through ERA funding from the federal government. If they had a pending application with that sort of program, then a landlord could not file an eviction for non-payment of rent while that application was pending. That protection lasted through the end of May, and so it was per the session law, it was set to expire on June 1st of this year, which it did. And so then what we started doing back in 2019 was our eviction prevention program, which I will just chat briefly about. Basically, in this program, we as Homeline go through and find the evictions that have been filed and send tenants letters letting them know that there's an eviction that's been filed, and that if they want some free legal advice, they can give us a call. What I'm going to do is pass it off to Oscar, who is the one who actually does all of that data collection. And he's going to kind of walk through quick how we get our data for that program. And then Andrea is going to cover more specifics about what that data actually is, what we've pulled in the last year or so, and what trends we've seen. All right, so Oscar, take it away.
Sounds good. As Rachel just said, my name's Oscar, Ozzy for short. In this part of the presentation, I'll be going over the data collection process, which is basically these two steps here, searching cases by date using Minnesota Public Access, or MPA for short. And then step two, which looks like two steps in itself, but it's really, they're both happening at the same time, how we access specific case details and then entering them into our own Homeline system. Yeah. All right. Yeah. And here on the first step, this is how we access cases by date. We use MPA. This is an mncourts.gov website. So it's as official as it gets here. Yep, and that's the website. We can go on the next one. And here's the prompts that it wants us to give to the system so that it knows what to show us, basically. We can search by county, and obviously we have the human verification at the top there. But yeah, most importantly is that section near the middle where it's asking us what date we're looking for, and typically we're looking for the last business day. So on Monday, we would look for Friday. Tuesday, we would look for Monday and the weekend, so forth and so on. Yep, next slide. And this is an example of what we would see after we answer all the prompts. Most importantly are the top two entries there in the cyan color. These are typical landlord versus tenant cases that we would send letters to, and that the tenants would be eligible for Homeline's hotline services. And because we are looking in this, if you look at the top of that screenshot there, we are looking in the civil, family, and probate case record search. That also gives us other types of cases that we just ignore. And the bottom ones in the orange there, these are technically eviction cases, but we also we do make note of them, but we generally ignore them because they're not cases that Homeline could do anything about. So foreclosures, commercial evictions, that type of thing. Yeah. So once we find the cases by date, like I said, these two steps here are kind of happening at the same time. We are looking for, in the first part there, we're looking for, we're using Macro to basically find the specific details of each cases that come up in our first search. And then sort of the second step to that is, yeah, entering them into our database. So, yep. So this is how we find specific details about each case. We use mcrow. And this again is an mncourts.gov website, just publicly available there. And I'll put these URLs in the chat too after we're done here, or at least after my section is done. So entering the system, it gives us one prompt this time. And it's basically asking for a case number, which we would have got from our first search by date. So we type that in, it gives us information, some information that we already know in the center there. But the main thing that we're looking for here is the complaint file. It's usually a downloadable PDF type file. So when we click into that, it gives us specific case details as to why, like the case was filed, for example, whether or not the parties have attorneys already, and other just miscellaneous information. So once we find that main information that we want from the complaint file, this is a quick screenshot of just what our database looks like on my end when I'm typing it in. And I've kind of separated it here by 3 parts in these colors. So on the next slide, we'll see how the first part is filled out. It is just generally the information where the tenant is being evicted from. Sometimes this is different when like the tenant moves out or something right after the eviction action. In which case then I would type the address where I want to send the letter to in this section. And then I would make note of the address where they're being evicted from in the notes section, which we'll touch up on in a little bit. So in the next slide, we'll see what part B looks like filled out. And this is what we're more or so doing internally with this data. So if we start up at the top, if we're sending a letter to them, we'll say yes, send to MHFA. We work with various partners in the field that are interested in our data. So we use that field to sort of call back to this particular set of data to be able to send to them. On the left over there is where we mark where certain events happen for the case. So when it is filed, when we collect it, when we send the letter to, if we are sending one, and then when the tenant called, if they call. And then if the letter is returned, which does happen quite often. So that's that. And then right there, the last section is case exception. This is situations where, yeah, like the orange example text that I had in the previous slide where they are technically evictions, but we as Homeland, we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So commercial cases, foreclosures, contract for deed. You'll also see there no summons issued. We used to not send letters until summons were issued, but more or less nowadays we're just sending them as they're being filed. So they're in the last section in the blue. We'll start up at the top again. So initial hearing date and time and access to hearing. Nowadays, we're not using this as much, like I said earlier, since we're just sending letters as they are being filed, as cases are being filed. We're not using that field as much anymore. Going towards the left, most eviction filings that we deal with can be summarized with the reasons listed there. Yep. And then if there's anything else that needs to be explained, I do type it in the notes section there. Obviously, some situations are more complicated than others, so it really does warrant some summarizing in the sort. And in case outcome, generally I'm typing in or I'm selecting the cases pending option. Sometimes by the time I collect it though, the next business day, if it's on a Friday that it's filed and then I collect it on Monday, you know, like the tenant moved out and so it's dismissed or something, there is turnover like that quickly sometimes. But generally, like if the letter is returned, I try and update that case outcome if there's any updates on the case. Yeah, nah, I guess that's it for data collection.
Perfect. Thanks, Ozzy. Appreciate that. And I just want to reiterate that if you've got questions about this going forward, feel free to use the Q&A section to ask those questions. I know that sometimes the data collection aspect of this can be a little dry. You know, data in general can be a little bit dry, but I think but we think it's important to show like this is how we are getting the numbers that Andrew will be talking about. That Oscar spends literally all day, every day dealing with. So, Oscar, do you remember how many letters you've sent out since you started in January?
Um, I can't remember the figure. I know from at least since May, it's been 8,000 So we might be well over 10,000 at this point. So maybe like 11 or 12.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So yeah, Oscar is a busy, busy guy every day. Okay, perfect. So thank you for that, Ozzy. I'm going to swap over to Andrea now, who is going to talk about what that data that Ozzy's been collecting and sending out for us, what that kind of looks like in a higher level and drilling down into some specific numbers and areas.
Okay. Excuse me. Okay. Um, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people who've been following eviction cases are familiar with this general picture. This is a graph of cases, and we're looking at cases that have been filed. Cases that have been filed since January 21st to the end of August. And you can see during the moratorium, there was a very limited number of eviction cases filed, mainly because it was very limited as to what landlords could actually evict people for, but then it gradually opened up and opened up and opened up. So the first red bar is October 2021, and that is when the initial kind of opening the floodgates happened. This is when a lot of the off-ramp protections ended, except for people who were being evicted for non-payment of rent who had pending applications with Rent Help Minnesota. Rent Help Minnesota was the state agency that was responsible for rent assistance during the moratorium and during the pandemic. And then the next spike is June of this year, and that's basically when the protections for tenants with pending applications ended. So you can see in those two particular areas of the graph that we did see a spike in filings after that. We're now trying to figure out what's going to happen next. There's been some talk that we have hit the heights of where it's going to go, and it's just going to be going down from here. There's some considerations that it's going to spike back up. We're looking at it from day to day. So from a day to day, really close viewpoint, it's up and down and up and down, but they seem to be staying cases that are filed are staying pretty much in a steady, the same area. So it's possible it could be plateauing. I do want to talk a little bit about the letters that we're sending. I came onto Homeline in 2019, and I initially came on to work on our eviction prevention project. And in 2019, we were sending letters only to the metro area counties. And when COVID hit, we opened that up to sending the letters statewide. So we are sending eviction, we call them eviction letters, but we're sending our letters statewide to tenants who have had cases filed against them. We're only working with residential tenants, and we're working with public data. All of the information that Oscar was mentioning in his part of the presentation, that's all publicly available. So it's through the Minnesota Court Information Systems, it's through Macro. And very often tenants get our letter before they get any notice of the case happening. So especially now, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Our letter basically says you've had an eviction filed against you. Here's the case number. Here's where you can look it up. And you may not have gotten the paperwork yet, and we encourage you to call us so we can talk about your case, talk about your options for presenting your case, defenses, and possible referrals to service. That's really what we're doing. We're telling them this has been offered and we want you to talk to us and get some information. We initially started this because in the ordinary course of events outside of COVID, eviction cases move very quickly. And it was Pre-COVID, it was not unusual for tenants to very suddenly find out, hey, you've got a court case, here's when you have to go to court. And it was a situation where they just didn't have enough information to go forward. So that's why we initially started the program in 2019. And COVID has put a completely different spin on everything. So here's what we're looking at. Kind of that was an introduction to what we're going to be going forward with in this section of the presentation. Next slide, please. So here we are in 2022. And again, you can see in June that we did have a spike in filings, and that was when landlords were able to file more freely for evictions for non-payment of rent. And excuse me, the total cases that have been filed so far in 2022, the number we came up with was 14,633. So that's just this chunk of cases right here. And again, you can see we were anticipating having a cliff, but we really didn't have a cliff of cases hitting at any particular time. They gradually crept up, almost leveled up in April and May, but they gradually crept up over time. Next slide. Now, I went back and looked at a couple presentations that we did before. This is kind of the bookend to some moratorium presentations that we had done before, and the recordings of our previous webinars are available on our webpage. But we did look at a typical year of eviction cases, and in the metro area alone, we're looking at about 10,000 cases getting filed, and in greater Minnesota, about 5,000. And the bulk of the cases filed in the metro area are from Hennepin County. And that makes sense because Hennepin County has the largest population. Hovering around 450 to 500 every month. So in July 2020, there was an estimation that there'd be 4,000 cases waiting to be filed in Hennepin County because they basically couldn't be filed, or statewide 15,000 cases waiting to be filed. So here's where we are in 2022. And again, the largest share of metro cases that was filed so far this year has been in Hennepin County. And the 46% number has been pretty steady. It's been that percentage of cases filed in the metro area has been pretty constant through 2020, 2021. And then after that, we're looking at Ramsey County, which makes sense. Population-wise, that's the next largest. And then Dakota is the third after that. In terms of numbers, Hennepin County, we're looking at about 4,600 cases and change, 4,687. And in Ramsey County, 2,560. So that's what we're looking at for the metro area. So this percentage-wise really hasn't changed that much from pre-COVID, I would say. And the next slide has greater Minnesota cases that were filed. And when you put, 80 odd cases together in a pie chart, some pieces get pretty small. We are getting eviction calls. We're taking calls from all over the state. Homeline takes landlord tenant question calls from all over the state, but we've definitely seen a spike in eviction calls from greater Minnesota. And the largest ones we're seeing county-wise are Olmsted and Stearns and Clay, and St. Louis. And that's 4,052 cases total there. So that's kind of gives you an idea of the numbers. When it comes to evictions, the the statute for evictions, everything lives in 504B for landlord tenant law. And eviction determines who has the right to the premises. It's not about the rent that's owed. It's literally who gets the keys. But very often, as you can see in the lion's share of cases, eviction is for non-payment of rent. So collecting the rent that's owed is rolled into determining who has possession of the premises. Very often when there's a case settlement, not only does the tenant have an agreement that will let them stay, but there's also an agreement to get the rent paid. And this hasn't, looking at 2022, even when we had a very low number of cases filed, this was still the major reason for evictions getting filed, for non-payment of rent. So this is for the entire state, for the 4,600 odd cases that we were looking at. And the next slide is taking us to the metro area, and you can see the same curve. It's still overwhelmingly non-payment of rent, and there's the spike right around June when when landlords were able to file more cases. Were basically able, I should say, to file cases for non-payment of rent more freely. And then here's Greater Minnesota, and you can see this is flattened out a little bit, but still it is the number one reason. Non-payment of rent is the number one reason for evictions. And again, there's the spike in June. So how are courts responding? Well, right now, one of the biggest changes that came out of COVID, I've noticed in terms of how courts operate, is putting more proceedings online. As of this point, housing court is considered to be a minor civil case, so they are basically virtual over Zoom, and they're going to be presumptively that way unless the presiding judge determines there's exceptional circumstances for doing otherwise. This is a little bit of a change from a previous order. The Minnesota Supreme Court order, where you can look this up, is the administrative order concerning the operations of the judicial branch. And initially, the decision about whether or not a case was going to be in person versus virtual was, it wasn't up to the presiding judge. It was up to basically one level up. The presiding judge really did not have the determination of whether that was going to happen. But now it's been dropped down to the presiding judge. So landlord tenant matters, eviction cases, rent escrow, ETRAs, those are virtual. That, on the one hand, that's really good. We are seeing fewer defaults in eviction cases. Many times, unfortunately, tenants don't attend the hearing. They don't go to court. They and if you're not at the hearing, you're going to lose. Probably the number one piece of advice I give is go to court. If you go to court, you have a say in what's going on. If you don't go to court, that's going to get taken away from you. So having virtual hearings has really improved the default rate. The downside of that, especially in Greater Minnesota, not everyone has a solid, reliable internet service in their area. Not everyone across the state, really, not everyone is computer savvy. It is possible, though, to phone in and do the proceedings over the phone. That is not as good, doesn't go as smoothly as Zoom, but that is an option for people who don't have access to a computer at home or who aren't able to use a computer. There's also, I should say, there's also sites set up where I might be getting ahead of myself here. There are sites set up where tenants can use a public kiosk, a legal kiosk. In some courthouses, if they show up, they're directed to a place where they can use a tablet and do their hearing there. So there are options available if tenants don't have computers. So that's kind of the big drawback there, that the virtual hearings are not the perfect answer right now. Yeah, the legal kiosk project, it's the advice there is to look into getting hooked up with a kiosk as far in advance as you can before the hearing. It can be kind of tricky to line one up like the day of the hearing or the day before, but it is possible to locate a computer setup in your area that will allow you to either look up your case information or do the hearing at the person. Very often these are in law libraries at the courthouses, but the key there is to look that up and get that scheduled early and as far in advance as you can. Okay. So in the metro area, and that's where we're seeing the bulk of eviction cases happening, standing calendars have been expanded. Previously in Ramsey County, housing court was basically 2 days a week in the morning, Tuesdays and Thursday mornings, and that has been expanded out morning and afternoon, 3 days a week. Hennepin County has added an additional calendar in the afternoon, 5 days a week. So again, these are virtual appearances, but they have added cases to their existing calendars. The problem that is causing this, I mean, number one, we have the increase of filings happening. We're seeing more filings hitting the court at the same time. And in 504B, 281 to 371, that's where the process for eviction is covered. The piles of cases coming into the court are creating delays in getting cases scheduled. And this is important because a summons cannot be issued until the hearing date is set. And the hearing date has to be not less than 7 and not more than 14 days from the time that the summons is issued. So it is really, really difficult for the court staff to be dealing with a boatload of cases that are coming in when there's not adequate space on the calendars. And the cases that are being heard now are not the cases that have been filed within the past couple weeks. They are from a month or two back, sometimes even longer. So this is what's causing the bottleneck, basically. And this is challenging. This is challenging for landlords. This is challenging for tenants that we talk to, because very often we can't give them a solid answer when their court date is going to happen. But on the other hand, to some tenants, it does work to their advantage. They've got more time to plan and figure out what they're going to do. Pre-COVID, the eviction process goes very quickly. Ordinarily, you'd be looking at something that would take 3 weeks, I should say, 3 weeks to a month from start to finish. Now we're looking at something that is taking far longer, and there's a lot of uncertainty on all sides. So that's where we're looking at with the need to add additional calendars and get creative in scheduling. Outside of the metro area, we're not seeing this same kind of situation. Cases are getting scheduled pretty close to the regular timeline. But especially in Hennepin and Ramsey County, there's a delay. Now up in the 6th district, St. Louis, Carlton, Lake, and Cook counties, those counties have consolidated hearings. So there's a single referee hearing eviction cases in those counties, and the bulk of them actually are coming out of St. Louis County. And they're more or less scheduled at the same time. And they're treating the first appearance as a case management conference, which very often is how cases really pan out. When a tenant has an eviction hearing, it's really the first appearance in the case, and most likely they're going to negotiate a settlement. Most cases end up with a negotiated settlement. So the 6th district is putting that out straight off, that when you go to court, you are going to be talking to someone and really discussing settlement. And there are services available excuse me, on the Zoom calls. There are people from legal aid. There are people from mediation services. And if they can't come to a settlement and there's a triable issue, the case is set on for trial. If they need more time to negotiate, a trial date is set, and they have between the initial appearance and the trial date to work out a settlement and let the court know what the result is. So that really, it very much reflects how housing court generally operates. The next slide is the 3rd district, and except for Rice County, they're doing very much the same thing. They have consolidated calendars, and services are available on Zoom through legal aid, SMERLs in the lower part of the state, and legal aid of Olmsted County. And again, the idea there is to have tenants talk to the other side and work on coming up with a settlement that will work for both sides. Settlements can be tricky. When it comes to the court's power, if both sides can't come to a settlement and the tenant basically admits to the allegations in the complaint, the best the court can do is give 7 days for the writ of recovery, which allows the landlord to get the sheriff and physically put the tenant out. The court can stay that writ for 7 days, and that's it. So anything longer than that, the tenant needs to get the other side to agree to it. And generally, if you have a non-payment of rent case, a settlement is going to be a way to get the landlord paid over time, a way to get outside assistance like the county emergency assistance or other organizations assistance, time to get that to the landlord. And then expunging the record when the settlement's complete. The expungement piece is very important. As I said, these are public from the time they're filed, and they're going to stay public until they're expunged. And it's possible to do that during the eviction court hearing. So it completely makes sense to include that in a settlement offer. I have noticed pre-COVID, landlords were pretty understanding, or landlords' attorneys, I should say. The majority of landlords in housing court are represented, and the majority of tenants are not. Prior to COVID, landlords were pretty understanding, and they weren't filing evictions necessarily very quickly. And when it came to a settlement, if they had a history with the tenant, if they knew they were a good tenant and they eventually would make good rather on what was owed, they would be pretty willing to extend that payment schedule out, maybe a month, maybe 2. We're not seeing that right now. Some landlords and landlords' attorneys are giving the 7 days to come up with the rent that's owed or the writ issues. So that's one thing I have noticed in talking with tenants and with talking to people who are seeing cases happen in court, that landlords aren't giving the slack that they used to. They're filing earlier than they used to. But on the other side of that, if you have a case that isn't going to be heard for a while, if the tenant finds out early what the situation is, if they hear from us or from any other resource, they've got time to kind of get the rent together, make some plans so that they can go to court and pay the rent that's owed the day of their hearing. So the other than go to court, when we're talking to tenants, especially tenants in the metro area, we are telling them that there is a very good chance that their hearing date's going to change. If they look up their case in Minces right now, some tenants will see that their case has been set off in December, and that that's a placeholder date. That is, we know from talking to court administration that date is going to change as cases get resolved and calendars open up. So we tell them right out of the gate, keep an eye on Minces. Check the page, check it often, because that hearing date's going to change. And once you have a hearing date set, that's when the summons is going to issue and the process gets set in motion. The other thing that we are stressing is go to court, do the hearing, figure out ahead of time what you need to do a hearing over Zoom, or what you need to do a phone hearing. And even things like make sure your phone is charged. If you're going to be going over to someone else's house, if you're going to another location to use a computer, make sure that you can get there in time. Be prepped to actually get on the call. If you run into any technical issues, if you drop the call, if you get disconnected, I'm always telling people get right back on, or keep trying to get back on, or call court administration, because that number is on the summons, and let them know, hey, I'm trying to do a hearing, I got cut off, I'm here. Because it's really important not to give the court the impression that you're defaulting on your hearing. And also we tell people that services are available in some counties. They're not available uniformly across the state, but in Hennepin and Ramsey and Anoka County, the Volunteer Lawyers Network and Legal Aid, SMERLs and MMLA and CMLS are available for eligible tenants to get legal advice the day of their hearing. And in some cases, they're able to pick up the case and represent them in court. Mediation services are available, and these, I think, are particularly helpful in situations where you have unrepresented parties on both sides. If you have the landlord and the tenant talking to each other directly, that can be a very fraught situation. So having a mediator working in that situation is really helpful. And they are available on some Zoom calls in Anoka and Hennepin and Ramsey County. And they're available, I think they're available in the 6th district as well. But with the 6th district, you do have the time between the initial appearance and the trial date to line up mediation if you need that. So definitely I'm telling tenants, take advantage of services if they're available at the counties. We do make referrals to Legal Aid and the Volunteer Lawyers Network. They're swamped right now. When I'm talking to tenants, I warn them. I mean, if they really want to talk to Legal Aid, I never dissuade them from talking to Legal Aid, but I will tell them, don't be surprised if they tell you that they will be able to talk to you the day of court and not until then, because they are very, very swamped right now. it is really helpful for a tenant to line up representation if at all possible. We know that if a tenant has a lawyer, they have a better result. The fact is there aren't enough lawyers to go around. So we do what we can to either help them line up representation, or if they're going to be representing themselves, giving them what they need to really speak for themselves, advocate for themselves, and get the best result they can out of their case. And that is what I've got. Ran through a whole lot of information really quickly. If you have any
Woo!
questions, feel free to email me or call me.
Yeah, and we have about 40 minutes of time to do questions as well. We had a couple of questions that were pre-submitted that we will get through as well, but there's a couple of people who've posted questions in the Q&A, but again, please feel free to post questions there. We will, and if they're not specifically about what Andrea or Ozzy talked about, but are landlord tenant related, we're happy to try and give that, give those a go as well. But I'm going to start in with the pre-submitted questions. We'll start with one that I believe was a little tongue-in-cheek, but John, who's an attorney, was asking, why are there so many evictions? And what a great question, John.
Honestly, I've been thinking about this. I think there are more cases getting filed. Really where we are right now, I mean, we have data through the end of August, and we've already surpassed kind of the typical number of evictions for a given year. So I think there are more evictions getting filed. And I think, and this is my opinion, I think that landlords hit the end of the off-ramp and they decided that this is it. They had to hold on to a lot of tenants that ordinarily they would not have had in their buildings. If a tenant, I should say, we're really talking about non-payment of rent cases here. At any point during the moratorium, if a tenant was a danger to other people in the building, if they were damaging property, it was possible to have them evicted. But when it comes to non-payment of rent, it really wasn't until June of this year that landlords had a much freer hand with that. And I think that they're making up for lost time in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think what the spike in June and July showed me at the various was that the phase out did what it was intended to do, which was keep the courts from getting completely inundated with eviction cases for non-payment of rent too fast, not having, as Andrew was alluding to, not having 15,000 cases filed in a week back in 2021. So then Carrie, who I believe is a service provider, asked, have courts and deputies who serve writs been able to keep up with the increase?
So far as I can see, sometimes there's a little bit of a delay getting the writ. At the end of an eviction case, if the settlement hasn't been fulfilled, or if the tenant doesn't show up, or if the tenant loses the case, that's when the landlord can get a writ of recovery. Sometimes that takes a little extra time, not outrageously much, because there is an extra step there. The landlord has to request the writ, and then the writ has to go to the sheriff. But there really hasn't been that much of a delay that I've seen with that happening. So from what I can tell, they've been keeping up.
Okay. Perfect. And then, yeah, the next one is, I don't know that we have the answer. I mean, actually, I know we don't have the answer to this, but the question is, we know of any programs that are for kids whose parents either passed or were affected by COVID-19? And that's from OC. And I will just say, typically when folks are asking us for financial aid advice, we refer them off to the United Way at 211 because that's a great place to start looking for what financial aid is available. Although minors typically aren't going to be eligible for that aid in any case. So keep that in mind, I guess, as well.
Yeah, generally when we get any kind of question about financial assistance for rent or really anything else, the first place we'll send people to for rent assistance is the county, and then after that, the United Way. And the United Way has the most up-to-date databases of the resources that are available in the state, so that they're really the best place to start for issues like that.
Right. Okay, David, who is a service provider, a mediator, asked, when do you view was or will be the peak of the evictions following the pandemic eviction moratoriums in Minnesota? Andrew, grab your crystal ball.
I think from what I'm seeing, it may have already passed. It may have been June, because that was the point when the off ramp basically ended.
Ozzy, you're pulling the numbers. Do you agree, disagree? Get out your crystal ball as well.
Recently, I do think that things are kind of simmering down.
Okay, Ozzy, I think we may have lost your mic. I'm sorry. No. Okay. So, and then Tim is a service provider, and Andrew, I think you covered this already, but they were just asking how quickly can Induce, Smirls, and other orgs respond to tenant requests for assistance with landlords?
If a tenant calls legal aid, they will get a call back. They definitely will. Given the bulk of cases that are happening, it's really difficult for us to say how long it's going to take for legal aid to respond. I have heard, I've had tenants tell me that it's taken a day or two. With anything involving evictions, even in the situation where we are right now, when the timelines are stretched out all over the place, it's still a good idea to get in touch with legal assistance as early as you can. And even if they're just going to tell you, we can't talk to you right now, but we will meet with you the day of your court hearing, it's still good to get those wheels moving as soon as you can.
And I can just say from Homeline's perspective, even though we don't offer representation to tenants, but like we're experiencing the highest call volumes we've ever had. At this point, we are, I think, every month thus far in 2022 has had a record number of calls that we have gotten from tenants come in. And so just month over month, we are getting handling more and more calls. So it's a busy place out there. So we take a couple of days certainly to respond back at times as well. So, okay, that was it for the pre-submitted questions. So thank you for all that. Now I'm going to go into what's in the Q&A. Looks like we've got a couple of them have dropped in. So some of these may be a little, I'll try not to repeat multiple times, but I think some of these you may have covered briefly, but if it won't hurt to reiterate and go into more detail with the question. So Rebecca is asking, right now, if you file an eviction action in Hennepin County, how long until a hearing date is set? How long until it's heard? And then how about Ramsey County? Andrea, you're on mute.
There we go. With Hennepin County, it's really hard to tell. If someone files a case today and they look up a hearing date, they're going to see most likely that it's scheduled for December. That's a placeholder date. So we're waiting to see what's going to happen with those cases, because those dates are eventually going to get scheduled. And it's difficult to know exactly when that's going to be. So that's a really tough, that's a hard question to answer right now. The cases that are being heard in Hennepin County, say today, they were filed a month or two back, maybe longer. In Ramsey County, they're taking a different tact. They are accepting the filings, but they are not setting a hearing date until there is an open spot on the calendar so that they can set the hearing date and issue the summons as is required by law. There's been questions about, well, why don't you just issue the summons when the case is filed? And the summons, the setting the hearing date is what triggers getting the summons out the door. So Ramsey County is not setting hearing dates or setting placeholder hearing dates. And I've seen maybe a month delay, little shorter than that. They're pretty close to getting things scheduled in real time. I did see we have someone from Ramsey County on the call, so you might be able to give me a more precise answer on that.
Oh.
And then the rest of the state, they're pretty close to the regular timeline, the pre-COVID timeline.
Yeah, some of the busier counties that you had pointed out, like Clay and Olmsted, might be a little bit delayed, but it's not too terribly bad. And that's one of the reasons why, like, our letters are sometimes the first thing that a tenant gets that even lets them know that the eviction is filed.
Right.
You know, because they may, if they don't see our letter, if they don't get something, they may wait, you know, in Hennepin County, they may wait over a month, maybe two even, to get a summons issued. So one of the nice perks about what we're doing is that, you know, as Andrew said, like, tenants get a little bit more time, you know, they know more, and knowledge is, you know, gives them the ability to make plans, right? So
I see that Michael Upton is weighed in from Ramsey County, and if you file in Ramsey County today, your hearing will be about 6 to 8 weeks out.
thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Perfect.
In most cases, I should mention, in most cities, it is not required for a landlord to give an advance notice of an eviction for non-payment of rent. In Minneapolis and Brooklyn Center
and St. Louis Park.
In St. Louis Park, a landlord is required to give prior notice before they file an eviction for non-payment of rent.
And to make it more fun, each of those cities has a different timeline.
Yep.
So check your local listings, basically. All right. We've got the next question here. I'm going to jump down to John's question because it's a little bit more specific to what you were talking about, Andrea. John is asking, generally speaking, has the ratio between metro eviction and greater Minnesota eviction rates stayed the same as pre and post pandemic?
I think they have. I think the percentages and the rates are pretty close to pre and post pandemic. I think we are seeing overall statewide more cases, but I think the rates and division between the two are pretty close. We are taking more calls from greater Minnesota tenants, which is interesting. And we're really seeing that, I think, for all landlord tenant issues. But I think they are staying pretty close ratio and percentage wise, even though we are seeing more cases filed.
All right, thank you. All right, I apologize if I mispronounced this. Renal is asking, it sounds like they're a service provider, but we've been hearing from county partners that families are increasingly sharing situations where landlords are not renewing leases for people who have received state rental assistance and or opting to increase rents and not renew for whole buildings at a time. Have you all been hearing or tracking this?
We've been hearing about that.
Yeah,
Yep.
we've definitely been hearing about it. Tracking it, we do have an organizing team, but it's our organizing efforts are really tenant led. And so if a tenant calls us who wants to say get help organizing their building or something like that, if they're experiencing that, that is something that we would hopefully have capacity to help them with, but it's really a tenant has to call, like actually ask for that sort of assistance as regarding like tracking that information.
One thing that Ozzy is doing, and we do keep an eye on, is if we see one landlord filing a whole bunch of eviction cases in one county, that's a tip off that potentially they may be doing something like doing evictions for the entire building, or evicting people for holding over after not renewing. We did see that happen with basically an entire building in New Brighton. And we were able to pick up what was going on and refer the situation over to our organizing team, and they were able to help the tenants organize and get more time to stay in the building, so that they were, this was pre-COVID, they were able to get more time to move out.
Mm-hmm.
So it is something we keep an eye on for sure. When it comes to people landlords not renewing if people have received rental assistance, we refer those folks over to the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. That's a potential discrimination issue. And again, if someone wants to make a report of what they consider to be discrimination, we will encourage them to contact the State Department of Human Rights, because that receiving financial assistance is a protected class.
Yep.
But yeah, I spoke to someone yesterday whose landlord flat out told her, "I'm not going to rent you anymore because you got state aid." And I thought, okay, you got your rent, you got paid, but definitely that was a Department of Human Rights issue.
Yeah. And I guess one thing I thought to point out here quick is that overall, there are not a lot of restrictions placed on landlords when it comes to not renewing leases or opting to raise rents. In general, there aren't. St. Paul is the only city right now that puts any sort of restrictions on rent increases of any sort. And Brooklyn, there are limited situations in which like a landlord has to have just cause to not renew a lease. So while it is certainly troubling if a landlord gives non-renewal notices to an entire building's worth of tenants, it may, be legal to do so. So just something, I guess, to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's something we would look at. Where are they living? What kind of building are they living in? Because like Rachel was saying, some areas and some types of buildings are limited in what they can non-renew for. In some instances, they have to have just cause. So when someone calls and even if they're not being evicted, even if they've just gotten a notice of non-renewal, we'll take a look at all of those factors and see what's going on with them.
Okay, and we only have one question left. So again, we've got a little over or a little under 20 minutes before we've got to end this. So if you've got, now's the time if you've got a question, you want some insight from some very experienced eviction attorney over there, or someone who's been doing all of our eviction prevention letters for a while now, now is the time. But because again, I'm sorry if I don't emphasize the right part of this, but AX is asking, they're a landlord, and they're asking if we have a list of attorneys who handle evictions in Hennepin County. They're trying to find an attorney to file an eviction. We aren't typically able to assist with landlords, so we don't maintain a list for that. I would definitely recommend going to the Minnesota Bar Association, has a lawyer referral service that you can do to kind of look through options and see who's available in your area.
We do have a referral list for landlord tenant, attorneys who handle landlord tenant issues from the tenant side. So and we provide it as a courtesy to people who call. If someone is going to be over the income limits for legal aid, or the Volunteer Lawyers Network will refer them to the list of people who have come forward and told us that they're willing to take tenant referrals from us. But otherwise, again, we refer people to the Minnesota State Bar Association referral service, and that's find a lawyer.
Yep, just very straight and to the point titling over there. Okay, so at this point, then, we are out of questions. I will say once again that we are going to apply for CLE credit for this, just standard CLE credits, and we'll send out that number once it is approved. If you do have other questions or more specific questions, feel free to give us a call or reach out to Andrea.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. Thank you,
Thank
Wendy.
you for that reminder, Wendy.
VLN does represent some low-income landlords. So the person who was asking the question previously regarding looking for a landlord attorney, you can try calling the Volunteer Lawyers Network. Thanks, Wendy.
Yeah, going to their website, which is vlnmn.org. Well, yes, I do have that memorized. All right, perfect. All right, well, thank you all again for your time and for joining us today. And again, we'll get this recording up on our website, hopefully in just a day or two. And again, goodbye and have a great rest of your day.